And we're back in the car like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your early Friday morning here with me in New York. But once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. Well, I'm wearing my Ali cap. It's actually a cap, for those who don't know. You've seen me with this. What's the story with that cap? It is a collector's cap from a one-off DC comic super duper special, no pun intended, a special collector's edition comic featuring, in 1976, Superman versus Muhammad Ali, which obviously that's totally ridiculous. But then again, the whole concept of Superman, you can argue, is completely ridiculous. But it was a very entertaining one-off comic. A lot of laughs, and Ali beating the crap out of Superman when, spoiler alert, Superman doesn't have his superpowers and he's just a guy who's 300 pounds of muscle. He has difficulty fighting an actual 200-pound plus fighter because he's just a guy from Krypton, and without his superpowers, doesn't really have much of a chance. He just gets dialed up. From a certain point of view, a little gallows humor there. But on this day, 1975, 50 years ago today, the 50th anniversary of Muhammad Ali's best performance during his 70s title reign. He had two separate runs as world heavyweight champion. The first one ended unceremoniously after 9 pretty easy title defenses when he was thrown out of the sport, and, you know, in a different version of the Matrix, probably spends the 5 years in prison for what ended up happening in the mid-60s. Can't really go into that because that's a couple of episodes right there. But his second title run, after he came back from his exile period, he actually lost a couple of tough fights. He lost to Joe Frazier. He lost to Ken Norton. But then he defeated, in what was at the time considered a shocking upset, and for the second time, and both times Ali won the World Heavyweight Championship, he was a huge, prohibitive underdog. And that's one of the kind of unusual and unconventional things about his career, because, for example, the 2 times that Mike Tyson won the World Heavyweight title, he was humongous favorites in both instances. But in the case of Ali, when he was just Cassius Clay, despite his undefeated record and how many easy fights that he had in his pro career, Sonny Liston was like a 6-1 favorite. He was supposed to kill the kid, even with the pedigree of young Cassius Clay being Olympic champion. And Sonny, well, maybe he's getting up there, and the kid is fast, and he runs around the ring. He's tough to square up. Very few people thought that he had a chance in that fight. And in the 70s, in large part because Joe Frazier had given Ali his first loss in 71, and Ken Norton had broken his jaw either very early in the fight or very late in the fight, depending on who's telling the story. And the fact that, as George himself pointed out, I was very confident when I fought Muhammad, I had beaten both guys he lost to. But you know, in boxing, it's very difficult. You can make predictions, but just as often as not, the predictors will have egg on their proverbial faces. So despite the fact that Ali had 2 really tough fights with Joe Frazier, winning the second one, and 2 even tougher fights, arguably, well, maybe not, but 2 exceedingly difficult fights with Ken Norton, both split decisions, Ali winning the second one, George smashed both of those guys in 2 rounds. Ali went out there in Zaire, Africa, right? The Rumble in the Jungle. And if you didn't know who was who, it didn't look like an upset. It looked like Ali was dictating pace for almost the entire way. So he defeated Foreman when he was a huge underdog. Howard Cosell, his buddy, a lot of people in the sport who, there were still a lot of people who hated Ali, but people within the sport didn't want him to fight George because they didn't want him to get seriously hurt. And the idea was that he was such a prideful individual. And every boxer has that fighting spirit. You don't get in the ring no matter. You're not going out there to lose. You're going out there to win. But the idea was that Ali had such pride that he was just going to keep, even if he was unconscious, there was something in him that was just going to keep getting up and acting as if he could continue when he was getting smashed. But he ended up defeating George Foreman to win the title, to regain the title. He was the first guy to do that, since Floyd Patterson, actually. And then his first fight after the George Foreman Rumble in the Jungle was the Chuck Wepner fight, which, as many of you know, that's how Sylvester Stallone ended up writing Rocky. It was the fact that Sly, who was already a working actor in New York, he happened to have the night off from whatever project I think he was already done with Farewell My Lovely at that point, so I don't know what he was doing. But Sylvester Stallone watched Ali's first title defense. They put him up there against a ham and egger, as Stallone describes his own Rocky Balboa. He's a ham and egger, but he was a fringe contender named Chuck Wepner, and Ali mostly beat the crap out of Chuck for 15 rounds. But Chuck did technically score a knockdown, and that led Sylvester Stallone to write what became Rocky. He was inspired. The Rocky saga, inspired by Ali in a kind of an indirect way, but he's inspired by that particular Ali fight. Ali's next title defense after the Wepner fight was against a bruiser, an absolute monster fighter from the era of the 70s, named Ron Lyle. And there are a lot of cliches when it comes to sports, and when people talk about things were better at a certain point in time versus another, or in the case of boxing, and this is not criticizing anybody in particular, there are certain eras in heavyweight boxing which are judged to be better than other eras. And the 1970s, it's one of the reasons why you go on TikTok and YouTube and Instagram, and when even contemporary boxers in some cases are asked to list the fighters they consider the best, Ali is usually the guy that ends up being named as the best. And part of it is that his career was fractured into two components. He was better in the 60s, but the toughness, the gumption, and the indomitable spirit and the will to win that he showed in the 70s is part of the legacy. The fact that he wasn't as good and still held his own and defeated the best names of what is considered the best era, which would be the 70s. So to be more specific, there are three great fighters from the 70s, guys in their prime who would be a tough out for anyone in history. You could go Tyson Fury, Alexander Usyk, Anthony Joshua, the Klitschko brothers, but the three names in the 70s, Ernie Shavers, Ron Lyle, Jimmy Young. And none of those three held a piece of the major, WBA, WBC alphabet soup. The IBF hadn't happened yet. But Ron Lyle was a fucking monster in the ring. Imagine a Razor Ruddock type fighter, but better. Because Ron Lyle, you could compare him to Ruddock. Ruddock was taller and a little bit broader, but Ron Lyle in his prime would have been favored to beat Razor Ruddock. What I'm saying is, if young Mike Tyson, because he came along at a time where the 70s guys were coming to the end, like Larry Holmes, and Michael Spinks winning the world heavyweight title when Spinks was a spectacular light heavyweight. If you could cross the space-time continuum and have Tyson fight prime Ron Lyle, Mike would be favored. That would not be an easy fight. He certainly wouldn't have been as big a favorite as he was against Trevor Berbick. That's for damn sure. But Ali didn't look good when he fought Chuck Wepner. It was a very sloppy and dirty fight. Neither guy looked great. Wepner was throwing rabbit punches. Ali was throwing rabbit punches. There was a kind of element of farce in that particular fight with all of the rough housing and everything that was going on. So when Ali signed to fight Ron Lyle for his next fight in Vegas at the Vegas Tropicana, he got into pretty much the best physical condition that he was capable of at that point in time. The thing with the Ali of the 60s, he always looked like he didn't have a bodybuilder physique. He didn't work out with weights in a conventional sense, but there are certain shots of him in the 60s where he looks like a guy. Well, he must have lifted. Look at the size of his arms. He didn't look like Kenny Norton or Evander Holyfield, if you want to go that way, or even a Cleveland Williams, who was pretty fucking diesel for a guy in the 60s. Harold Johnson, another guy who looked like he lifted. But the Ali of the Lyle fight was in fighting trim. You could see the ab muscles, and it's not really that important because Ali, there are fights where he didn't look like he was in particularly great shape, such as the Thrilla in Manila against Frazier later in 75 in September. I think that was his next fight. But he had a motor that didn't stop. And that was another thing that set him apart, because when you're a big guy, especially if you're fighting in 90 degrees, I don't care who you are. There's a reason why the rough and rowdy and the tough man contest, they got 1 and 2 minute rounds. You're not supposed to be able to go 15 rounds at breakneck speed, throwing bombs all night, and then you still have enough energy to even get off your fucking stool as it turns into the 11th and 12th round, and you got another 4 rounds to go, champ. So Ali was ready for the Lyle fight. But by this point in his career, he had two things that he could do in a fight. He could go out and fight for real and fight hard all the way, or he could try to steal rounds and conserve energy in case it got to the later rounds. See, the thing with Ali, on top of so many other attributes, is he didn't have only one way to fight. And he usually knew exactly which tools to bring to a fight. He knew when he needed to try to coast and build up points, not take that much punishment, and then save energy in case he fell behind, maybe if he took a knockdown. You don't know what goes through the mind of a fighter. But in the Lyle fight, Ali fought very cautiously, didn't want to get embarrassed. Nobody wants to get knocked unconscious, because then, part of the legacy is a guy laying there with his eyes glassy and staring into nobody wants that. And especially a legendary name like Ali already was. He fought very cautiously with Lyle, knew how dangerous Ron was. And Ali's tricks and tactics of trying to steal rounds didn't really work, because he was behind on the cards after 10 rounds. It was a close fight, and you hate to be cynical, the sense usually was that Ali was going to win those close rounds, because there were a number of rounds which normally he would have been given, which this particular night, maybe the judges didn't like him because of the Vietnam era. We don't know. But he was down. It was not insurmountable. This was not, 6 years later, Thomas Hearns and Ray Leonard, but he was down on the cards. And he needed to do something other than just try to steal rounds. But because he had fought a certain way, and despite as hard as Ron hit, Ali really didn't take that much punishment in this fight. And this is another fight that looks good for Ali historically, given what happened in Lyle's next fight, but we'll get to that. So in the 11th round, Ali is down. He's probably losing like 5-3 with 2 even, 5-4 with 1 even, or maybe just 6-4. I apologize, I didn't check because you can look this stuff up. Another great thing about the internet, you can look this stuff up, and say, oh my God, look at the scorecards. And this is something I've mentioned before, but for those new to the channel, Ali fights were notoriously difficult to score because of his ring generalship, which I would say is the greatest, no pun intended, of anyone who ever fought. And in the case of this, what I mean by ring generalship is that he just looked like he was dictating pace almost all the time. He seemed to be in control of fights where he was not in control, and he would steal rounds because whatever he was trying to do, he just looked so damn comfortable in that ring. So for example, when Ali fought Norton in the return fight, there were people that a couple of people thought he could have got the decision in the first fight, but most people felt he was lucky that it was even a split decision, that, hey, it's a tough fight, but Kenny won this one 7-5, or, like that kind of thing. But in the fight against Norton that Ali won, one judge had Kenny winning the fight 6-5 with 1 even. Another judge had Ali winning it, I think, just 7-5 straight up. And then a third judge had to fight 9-1 Ali with 2 even. You look at those scorecards and you say, how can this be the same fight? That was the issue. But the Lyle fight, the scores are not as wacky as that. Ali was down, but he had 5 rounds left, and in his mind, I feel like his corner somehow got some information illegally, because he came out in the 11th round like a guy who needed a knockout to win, when he really didn't. He just needed to put a couple of good rounds together, if he could. I mean, it's easy for me to sit here 50 years later and say, oh, you just needed to put together a couple of good rounds. Lyle was a fucking killer in there. But he went out in the 11th. And the thing with Ali, because he wasn't known as a tremendous hitter, and George Foreman also talked about this, because I knew Mohammed, as he always called him Mohammed, I'm not mispronouncing his name. That's just how George pronounced it. Remember, George was from Texas. He said, I knew Mohammed couldn't punch. And he wasn't saying it in a defamatory way. He simply meant that Ali was not a fighter who was going to take a guy with an iron chin, such as George Foreman. He wasn't going to take him out with one shot. That wasn't the kind of fighter that Ali ever was. So you could get into and feel a false sense of security because he wasn't a huge hitter. But the fact that he was not George Foreman, losing, 8 out of 9 rounds to Michael Moorer before landing one seemingly not even a loaded punch on Michael Moorer, and they could have counted to 1,000. Ali wasn't that kind of fighter. So Ron Lyle was not as cautious as he probably should have been. And in the 11th round, as Howard Cosell, Ali's friend, and he was the lead commentator that night, Ali landed a really strong lead right hand. And this thing is, Ali normally wouldn't throw lead right hands. He did it with Foreman in Zaire because he tried to knock George out early, which seems completely insane. But his theory was, I got to try to get George early. I'm going to try to take him out in the first round. Hey, good luck. But Ali normally wouldn't do that. He didn't like the potential return fire coming back his way of taking the risk of throwing a lead right hand. But he throws a lead right hand about, I guess, halfway through the 11th round. And you can't do it any better. And even if he was not a big puncher per se, 215, 220 pound man who, as I say, looked very, very fit, the abs in this particular fight, when a guy like Ali leveraged his punches, he could bang with anybody. And Angelo Dundee talked about it, said, my guy can really hit. Don't let anybody tell you he can't punch. Again, the phrase he can't punch it's not a literal interpretation. But he landed a big right hand. Lyle staggered. And about 50, not exaggerating, about 50 punches later, the ref stopped the fight. But it's interesting and important to note that for the second time since coming back, Ali had a dangerous fighter, in this case, Ron Lyle, and it happened in the second fight with Jerry Quarry, with, I think that was 72. I'm not 100% on that. He had a hurt fighter in front of him, and he kept waving for the ref to stop the fight. Because, yes, you're at the highest levels. This is a heavyweight championship fight. But Ali still saw himself as a sportsman, as a human, as somebody who actually cared. And yes, he's trying to separate his opponent from his senses, but he doesn't want to inflict permanent damage. It's not his process. So as soon as he does not think that Lyle can defend himself, he starts to shorten his punches. He starts pulling his punches. And he starts to wave the ref over as if to say, bro, you don't need to let this continue. Just stop the fight. Come on. Look at the fighter in front of me. He can't stand up straight, please. He doesn't say this, but the gestures with his arm and looking for the ref. He doesn't want the fight to continue. Well, he's not going to quit because he's winning. But eventually the ref stopped the fight, and Ali was declared winner by 11th round TKO. And it is a commanding performance. And looking back on it, it feels as if Ali's victory is inevitable, because as much as Lyle lands some nice shots, there are moments earlier in the fight where Lyle appears shaken up and Ali simply isn't able to capitalize, because Ron was a really good fighter. He knew how to put his hands up when he was a little bit, off balance. He got hit hard, whatever, squared up. But when that fight ended, and it was a sense, this was a great performance by the champ. This guy is a top end fighter. This is someone who would have been a champion in a later era for almost 100% certain. I mean, he was, no offense, he was better than John Tate and Mike Weaver. It's arguable about Michael Dokes. Dokes' prime was too short. It's certainly close, because Ron Lyle learned how to fight in prison, had beautiful technique. He really had great technique. But Ron Lyle's next fight is a pivotal fight in history, because he fought George Foreman. And he knocked Foreman down twice. It might be the single best action fight in the history of the heavyweight division. It was a non-title fight. He knocked George down twice, and George kind of didn't give himself enough credit for the fact that he got up twice when the fight would have been over. Ron landed bigger shots on Foreman than he landed on Ali. And remember, George had a fucking cast iron chin. I know Ali is credited with a knockout in Zaire. George is up at the count of 8. George's spirit and his will was somewhat broken, because he couldn't knock Ali out, and he kind of ran out of gas. But George was one hell of a fighter and one hell of a tough cast iron chin. And for Lyle to knock him down twice, think about the bombs that Evander Holyfield landed on George. He barely moved him except in the 5th and 7th rounds. And George was as tough as anybody. So when Foreman won that fight, it looked like George was back on his way to a title shot. And then he lost to the other great fighter from the 70s, including Shavers and Lyle, Jimmy Young. And that's when George had his 10-year retirement, when he found God and did something else. But on this day, 1975, 50 years ago today, at the Las Vegas Tropicana, the man generally regarded to be the greatest heavyweight who ever lived, and, top three certainly greatest fighters who ever lived, Muhammad Ali, had his best performance in his second reign as undisputed world heavyweight champion. Muhammad Ali defeats Ron Lyle by 11th round technical knockout. This has been episode 513 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all so much for spending some of your early Friday morning here with me in New York. And if you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Till then, peace.